How you doing, folks? Hey, I've biked the trail quite a lot. I used to walk it when it actually had railroad tracks and ties and things on it, and quite often when I was going along the trail, I kept finding things that I said, I wonder why that's there, or what's that's left over from, things along those lines. And finally, I collected enough stuff to put together a presentation. Hopefully you'll find it somewhat interesting. Irv, could you hit the lights? I'm going to start off going through the true history of the railroad, why all this stuff got started, who started it, the various companies along the way, names you'll recognize probably as being part of it, like the Hartford, Providence, and Fishkill, and some names you might not really recognize. For some reason, certain names stuck, and other names got lost along the way for companies that were involved. The next part after that, we'll start at one end of the trail. This is not just an Andover set trip presentation. It takes the entire length, 20-mile length of the trail from Colonial Road in Manchester to the Willimantic River down in Columbia. We'll just start at one end and go through it and see what was there and what's left there today. And then the last section will be talking about the conversion from the railroad into the trail that we have today along the way. So let's get going. Railroads came to Connecticut beginning in about 1832. There was Stonington. In Stonington, they chartered the New York, Providence, and Boston. It was basically a line that was supposed to go from the docks in Stonington up to Providence. It took them about 5 years to get anything built at all, but ultimately they did have a short line that came off the shoreline and went up. Most of the early railroads in Connecticut did exactly that. They followed the rivers and they went down to the docks on Long Island Sound. There was always, primarily it was a north-south thing because it was easy. You went along the river banks. You didn't have, you had small tributaries maybe to cross, but you didn't have the Connecticut River that you had to get across. You didn't have to get through the mountains on either side of Connecticut River and things along those lines. So that was what the early railroads were. Long 1833, there was noise about making a railroad from Hartford into the Bolton quarries. There was an awful lot of quarrying going on, Quarryville and Bolton. And they were thinking, we put in a railroad through there, we can haul all this stuff down the Connecticut River, get it on the river boats real easily. A lot of that stone was going to New York for a lot of the building that was going on there. Unfortunately, it was never properly funded, and it never came about. I shouldn't say it never came about. It didn't come about until the Hartford and Providence came along, picked up that charter, and went a step further. They weren't going to just go to Bolton. They were going to go all the way to the Connecticut line and meet up with the Providence and Plainfield so that they could get a railroad going from Hartford over to Providence. So this company, the Hartford and Providence, actually began the construction of the line and actually did most of the construction on the part that we're going to be talking about going from Manchester to Willimantic. Construction in those days was very manually intensive. The fills, all the blasting, all the drill holes were manually done. This is actually a picture from out west. Unfortunately, I don't have anything from the east that I could find, but it's the exact same process. When they were doing that big fill over here in Coventry, and if anybody's been on this thing, it's incredible to look down and just think about the manual labor that went into dumping all that dirt, but that's how it was done. People filled those carts. Oxen in our case generally, rather than horses, but they took the carts and they dumped them and they went around and made another trip. But it was, in our area, basically Irish laborers that were just sitting there filling these things up. A lot of black powder was poured into the boreholes that they did, and chunks had to be small enough that the men could pick them up. There were no steam shovels, there were no hydraulics or anything along those lines that there is today for construction.
When you say black powder, do you mean an explosive or?
Black powder, gunpowder. It's the same thing you'd put in a musket.
Okay.
You just took barrels of black powder, poured it down the hole, and touched it off. If you were lucky, you got out alive. Once you got a level area with drainage on the sides, you basically just laid out, the real early ones, you just laid out logs. They really didn't have ties, so to speak. They laid out logs. The engine would come along, you'd have some rails on there, men would pick up the rails, carry them down, hunk them down, spike them in, and that was your railroad. The whole idea of ballast and stuff really came later. Wrong way. I hate this, the buttons are backwards from what I'm used to. Drilling of stone. You can find these remnants of the stones where they quarried them all along the railroad right away. This one happens to be up on what I'll call Bingham's Hill, right across from the church. It's on private property, but there's just as many quarries if you go down where the overpass is on Merritt Valley Road and walk up on the town property there, just to the right of the gas lines. There's tons of outcroppings and things where the stones have been cut. These were all done by hand. They had single jacking. Generally, when you're doing these, you would just have a drill and a hammer and sit there until you got the holes down. When you got done, you would hammer dried wood plugs into the holes, go along, pour water on it, and let nature take its course. The pressure of the dried plugs sucking up the water would pop the rocks. If you were going real far, like trying to drill into where we were going to drop the black powder and stuff into some of the big cuts, this is cutting stone for like the bridges in the construction area. Generally, the double jacking would be more where you're drilling the big bores where you're going to drop the black powder in just to make the cuts. But again, all manually done. I wouldn't want to be the guy holding that drill. It's a lot of trust on the two guys swinging. Again, the name I gave out, a lot of people and a lot of the plaques I see over in Vernon and other places all talk about the Hartford, Providence, and Fishkill. That's the combining of the Hartford and Providence, which was the Hartford to Connecticut line railroad, and a railroad that was going to go in the westerly direction, the New York and Hartford, and that was going to go to Brewster eventually. The reason we have the name Fishkill instead was by the time the merger came about, Fishkill on Hudson had replaced Brewster as the westernmost destination. Still, the idea was to get materials to the river so that it could be then trucked down to or shipped down to New York City and other places. The Hartford, Providence, and Fishkill gets the pleasure of saying that, okay, we actually opened the line on December 1st, 1849. That was when the first train traversed the Hartford to Willimantic leg. Wrong button again. A lot of paper still exists. I find this part fascinating. The rest of you might find it totally boring, but there's one of the things that the railroads did, and it's kind of a theme through this entire part of the section, is they were very good at generating paper, very good at raising money, not always so good on delivering. These are questionable whether you really considered them investments. A lot of time it was almost pure speculation as to whether you were really going to get paid these interest payments, whether you were going to get your money back when you loaned it to the railroads or you bought stock. This happens to be a mortgage bond and a bond here, but there were also lots of stocks that were floated as well. The early railroads had engines a little different than we're used to for normal steam engines, wood burning. This is just an American 440. It's the most common engine that would have come through. That very engine probably came through Andover. I can't prove it, obviously, but the Hartford, Providence, and Fishkill didn't have all that many options. It's just running basically between New York and Willimantic or Providence eventually. So more than likely that engine probably came through town at one point in time. Again, just some more stuff. You had rail passes that all the railroad employees would have gotten those and other VIPs, so they didn't have to pay along the way. A lot of the railroad debts were paid in script rather than paying real money. They would say, here, we're going to owe you, and maybe you can trade this in for stock. This one, I think, is good for like a 6/10 of a share of stock or something like that. Again, very cash poor, though they did write out some fairly decent checks. This one for $670, which in 1853 was a good chunk of money. Dang, sorry about that. I'll get it before we're done. The railroad pretty much lost money all throughout its existence. In 1855, the ex-governor of Rhode Island happened to be president at the time, Mr. Sprague. He had a very successful investment company, and he covered the losses. Finally, in 1857, the mortgage trustees foreclosed, and they continued to run the railroad for the next 21 years. So it was really, it kind of went into bankruptcy and never came out for all intents and purposes. Along the way, the Rockville branch and the Manchester branches of the railroads were connected. There was a spike that went off at Vernon Station to go up to Rockville 4-mile piece. And the Cheney brothers, soap mill fame, built a 2.7-mile leg to go down and service their part of Manchester. While the Hartford, Providence, and Fishkill was in the bankruptcy during that 20-some-year period, in theory, they were merged into the Boston, Hartford, and Erie. Fortunately, I'm not sure which it is, the Boston, Hartford, and Erie was nothing more than a bottomless pit for money. Basically, the more money investors and the more money government threw into it, the more the 2 or 3 guys at the top got rich, took off with it, and the railroad really never got anywhere. But this is part of why the Hartford, Providence, and Fishkill, the people that had taken it over refused to ever allow the Boston, Hartford, and Erie to really claim the railroad. So they kept it as a separate entity. Somehow they were able to keep it running on its own. It was never fully merged in, though on paper it was. Again, they just generated paper upon paper, more mortgages, more stock, more everything that virtually became useless or worthless over time. Ultimately, that translated into, okay, now we've got to create another entity. So the New York and New England was created. They went bankrupt. It's a common theme. They came along, they took over, they went bankrupt. Again, a lot of people lost money. They also, anybody who wanted to keep their stock certificates, this was a little bit different version of the bankruptcy. You could keep your stock and keep the value in the new company if you paid another 20% in. So if you had $100 worth of stock, you paid in $20 more and you were able to keep your stock certificate. If you didn't pay in, you lost it and it was worth nothing. Yep. Most of the rail line along through here was kind of built all at the same time. So it's not like they were laying rail as they were constructing, because we had, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but you had things like the Tunnel Road in Vernon. That was a 2-year project building that. So it's not like you could kind of build that and forget about what's ahead of you, because we had a large stone project down here at Burnett Brook Road, almost the same as in size and grandeur as what's on Tunnel Road. So that was probably a 1.5-year project. So you didn't wait for the 2-year project in Vernon, then build another mile on the end of that, and then get to the next pond or river you had to cross to get that done. It had construction going on the entire 20 miles throughout most of the 2 years that this was being built. Get the right button this time. Again, the Hartford New England went bankrupt. It came out as the New England, and then the New England goes bankrupt. So at that point in time, it was leased to the New York, New Haven, and Hartford, better known just as the New Haven Railroad, the mighty New Haven. And it was finally absorbed in 1908 into that rather large operation. Again, the New England, the New Haven, generated paper up the yazoo. They went bankrupt in 1935 after the Great Depression. They didn't survive that. They did fairly well through the war years. And then in 1961, again, that was pretty much the death knell to a lot of railroading in New England. This is the Comet here, which was supposed to be the equivalent of a bullet train today, we'd call it. It was going to be high-speed rail between New York, Boston, and Washington. They were going to be, I think they built like 6 of these, and they were going to offer high-speed rail. It was never meant to come through Andover, but that is in Andover, sitting at Andover Station. My grandfather had some pull, and he got it to come over so that the elementary school students could all get a tour on it. I think they only lasted 3 or 4 years. They did not turn out to be very successful, neither in their speed nor their... they broke down a lot, so they went just back to regular transportation. Along the time that the New Haven had control of the line and had it outright, they did come through at one point in time, 1912 specifically, and upgraded everything. If you remember the American 440 that I showed you, that was a relatively light engine. The boxcars were relatively light at the time. The freight wasn't nearly what it was. But as things are progressing into the 20th century, things are getting much heavier, and they had to upgrade the bridges. All the steel in the bridges had to be upgraded. The rail was actually, heavier rail was put in along the line. But what had transpired between 1849, when they built this originally, and when they upgraded in 1912, was now reinforced concrete was the building material of choice, not stone. So a lot of places you'll see where the old stone was, there was obviously a steel bridge across here at one point, but they decided, we're going to encase it all in concrete as we go. Where they upgraded the steel, they put in heavier steel, you can see there's always a concrete portion where they'd taken out the rocks or whatever they needed to do, the original stonework, and they refitted it all with concrete. So you can tell where all the upgrades were made along the way. These are all modern pictures taken within the last month, by the way, or earlier this spring anyways. Again, the New Haven went bankrupt. For some reason, the politicians and the government decided that if we take 3 bankrupt railroads and put them together, we can create something better out of it. So we took the Penn Central originally and we took the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad and we created the Penn Central, 2 mega railroads that had gone bankrupt. We said, okay, we made them into the Penn Central. Now the New Haven's gone bankrupt. Well, we'll just put a 3rd bankrupt railroad in there, and obviously all will be good. Well, needless to say, all was not good. Within 1 year of the merger, they were bankrupt. And again, this is just part of the downward spiral of New England railroading in general. So needless to say, the Penn Central went belly up. Yep. The right-of-way was then sold to Connecticut DOT in 1976. The last train went through, by the way. There's 2 different theories. I've seen September 29th, 1970 as the last train going through. I've also seen a 1973 date as the last train going through. Either way, the train that went through in 1970 was about 4 cars. I think it was just moving something kind of ceremoniously. If something went through in 73 again, I don't think it was really a true train like we had seen. When I was a little kid going up on my grandfather's bank to watch the trains go through, there were lines and lines and lines of cars full of cars. They were actually transporting cars along the lines and stuff, and the way it went. Anyways, along the way, in 1987, the right-of-way was transferred to the DEP, and that's pretty much the beginnings of when the talk of converting into a really usable trail was. We'll now go into what was there for railroad infrastructure and what's still there today. Again, the Hop River Linear Trail State Park, or whatever the heck it's called, it's got about 4 different names that people use for it. Begins over here. The part we're going to talk about starts at Congress Street in Manchester and runs down here to the Willimantic River. It's a little over 20 miles in length in total. Obviously, Vernon had some pull. Otherwise, I would have thought making the railroad go right across here would have made a lot more sense. But again, they tended to go where the money and the politicians were, so we made a loop up to Vernon. I think I just said Congress Road. It's Colonial Road in Manchester. Actually still has some rails laid there. Beginning of it, there's a parking lot basically that I'm standing in. Nice little place to get on the trail. First thing you would have run into going east from there would have been the Tulkaville station. There was a bunch of mills and things that many of which are being renovated now, or at least the largest one in Tulkaville is being renovated now. This station was right here at Mile Hill Road, or Elm Hill Road. Not very far from the Vernon station, which is only a little further away, but they had their own little station. And what's nice about Vernon is they've done a lot of work. They actually marked where most of these things are. So even though there's no remnants of this station left, there's no foundation, there's no nothing there, they have it well marked where this was. So you can get off, you can read a little bit about it, see some photographs of them. Going up the line a little further is the Vernon station. Hopefully that'll go away. Pay attention to this roof for the next slide I'll show you. But you can see what was going on in Vernon. Vernon was a very active place. They had like 7 or 8 tracks across. They had the station here. We had a turntable here because this is where the Rockville line came in. And it was just a single line of track, and steam engines were not bidirectional for efficiency's sake. You can run them backwards, but it's not very efficient at all. So at each end of the line, they had a turntable in there just to be able to turn it around. As you can see, they had an interlocking tower which to control all the switches for all this track, and they had a nice water tower off to the side. What's there today? Well, they got a nice little pavilion with a roof that mimics what the station looked like, which is nice. They have the footprint of the station actually marked out. Those timbers are the actual footprint of the station. So you know exactly where the station was. They got the little raised area with picnic tables. The turntable pit is there, not well dug out, but you can certainly see it. It's defined. You know exactly where that was. And the footings for the water tower. I think there were supposed to be 6, and there's 5 of them left. Somebody made off with one of them. But again, a nice thing that Vernon's done. They won some awards for all the work they did on the trail along the way. Leaving the station area, this is the first overpass you would have run into. In those days, it was, again, they would have a block retaining wall here, and very short bridge, actually. This is actually the steel that came out of the bridge sitting on the side of the trail. But in this case, they didn't try to bridge it like we ended up doing with ours. They just have a little spike that goes down to the lower part across and up. A little further down the line from that, you come to the tunnel on Tunnel Road. As I said, that took about 2 years to construct this. As far as I know, no real maintenance has been done on it, and the entire time it's been there, it just stands. Monument to the gentleman that built it. Nice plaque down below telling you all about it, when it was built, about something about the dimensions and the people that were brought in to build it. Further down the line still, actually right at the Bolton and Vernon town line, had 2 sides of track, a main track and a siding. You had a section house. A lot of places along the line, we only had a single layer or a single line of track going through, but you had trains obviously going east and west all along the way. You had sidings every 5, 6, 7 miles so that they could pass each other. And you had a section house with the signals that controlled when somebody could go through, who needed to go off to the side, onto the siding and wait for a passing track. This was called Clubhouse. Well, first of all, it's well marked. Again, Vernon does a very good job. Wherever something along those lines existed, they've marked it. You got a nice bench. You can actually see some ties are still here along the edge from the main line. One of the very few places that there are still some ties out there. The reason this was called Clubhouse, one of the things I had always wondered about is what this pavilion was doing out here in the middle of nowhere. So I researched it a little bit and found out there used to be a clubhouse actually on that site, built in the early to mid 1850s. One time it was owned by the executives of the railroad, and they had a nice pond you can see in front here, and it was for fishing and hunting, and they had it as their own private little retreat out here in Bolton. Passed through a number of hands in 1968, I believe it is. Yes, it burned, and they decided they would build this pavilion instead of resurrecting a clubhouse. The pond itself went out with the 38 hurricane, so you can see the remnants of the dam, but there's nothing but a flow of water through there. Basically, it's called Railroad Brook, coming out of the big pond up by where the main station was. But again, it's one of those things that always puzzled me as a kid as to why somebody built that pavilion out there. I'd never seen it used, and today it's pretty much just falling to rot. But that's why it's there, or at least not so much why, but why there's something there at all is really the remnants of this clubhouse. You want to read any more about it on the Bolton Historical Society site. There's a page and a half or so written by Rick to tell you more about it. Moving on further still, you get to where the Bolton station was. Like a lot of stations along the way, this station burned in 1902. These two are the original station. This is the replacement station. Andover station burned in 1880. Unfortunately, I don't have any photos of the original station. We'll soon see photos of the replacement station, but this one was late enough that we have pictures of both. In the early days, the road, what's probably known today as Route 6, came down by a number of buildings along here, came across the railroad tracks, and then you went up where the utility poles are today. There were no bridges there originally. What's there today is just basically a parking lot and, of course, the concrete tunnel, as they call it. Bolton does have a couple of markers along the way, nothing nearly as extensive or well laid out as what's in Vernon, but at least there's something there, which there is not in our town. This was my attempt too late in the year to really show the difference between the tunnel that's there today and the original bridge that was built in 1905. But in 1905, they decided rather than going across the railroad tracks down here and then up this road, they would actually make a road go up through the cut a little bit and put a concrete bridge across there. So in 1905, that's Route 6 was redirected there. You no longer had to come down here and across to make it up to the rest of Bolton. You could still get down to the station, obviously, but you could get over the railroad bed.
Scott,
Yeah.
at that location in Bolton, that was the highest point on the run between Manchester and Andover. And my father tells the tale of he and another gentleman named Guy Bartlett would go up to Bolton, and the railroad would leave their maintenance hand cars up there with the little carts behind them, and they would unhook the cart, get on the cart, and ride it down to Andover. And they thought that was a lot of fun.
I can imagine. It probably got going at a pretty good clip. Eric?
Where exactly is that relative to the large concrete tunnel now?
This edge is basically, we'll get to that. That edge is basically the edge of the existing one.
Okay.
If I get this right. What Peter's talking about is actually a little bit further from what that first slide showed, but right about here is where the crest is. You had these telltales and you had the Route 6 bridge. If you are going up Route 6 today toward Bolton and you look off to the left just past the Ice Palace, you'll see the power lines disappear into the woods. That's where the original route, not the original, but that's where this Route 6 went. And it went through this bridge, and you had the telltales because this is where it's now starting downhill to Bolton, as Peter just mentioned. I'm sorry, downhill to Andover from Bolton. And you would have brakemen in the early days that had to walk along the top of the cars in order to turn the brakes, set the brakes, because you're now heading downhill. You didn't want the train to get away. Well, if he happened to be standing up, he'd probably get cleaned off the top of the car by that bridge. So they had these telltales to whack them in the head and tell them they got to get down. Otherwise, they're going to get knocked off. I assume these are the bridge abutments you're talking about. That's what, again, held this bridge going across that was the old Route 6. So this was never a concrete bridge at this point in time. This was where it went across, where the utilities now go across. But those are still there. Those are neat to get up on. A little bit further down, it's not much to look at, and it's very difficult to find if you don't know it's there, but Toomey Road used to go down and meet up with Route 6. Very next, this is Stony Road. This was Route 6, and you can see here where it went across the railroad tracks, the bridge I just showed you. Now it goes around. But Toomey Road used to go down through here, and the way they'd block off roads in those days is they'd just take a piece of rail, or actually 3 pieces of rail, drive 2 into the ground, weld 1 across the top, the road's closed. That's right at this mile marker, about 7/10 of a mile from Steele's Crossing Road. Steele's shanty, again, this is a shanty built to control, it's a blockhouse for all intents and purposes. It would control who needed to go off on the siding here so that another train could pass. It would control who could go up the main line. So again, what you're being told here. Instructions came from telegraph down into the shanty, and it would control the block. Now, even though this is labeled Steele's, and it's certainly labeled Steele's Crossing, this is not Steele's Crossing Road. This is very much closer to where Toomey Road went through. This entire siding had come back to the main line by the time you get to Steele's Crossing Road. So when you hear about Steele's Crossing, again, 0.7 of a mile away from where Steele's Crossing Road is today.
That was a pretty narrow.
Single track through the cut. Yep.
Is that where it starts to be double track all the way down to Andover?
No. There's no double track all the way down to Andover anywhere. Andover's siding started by Shoddy Mill Road and came through. This siding ends before you get to Steele's Crossing. Yeah, there were times that there were over 40 trains a day going in both directions. Not 40 going in both directions, but 40 trains, 20 of which going in both directions, and they all had to pass on one of these sidings somewhere along the line. And it was very important to get your signals right, because if you proceeded on through and somebody was coming the other way, because you're supposed to be waiting on a siding or something, that's when you had head-on collisions. Luckily, there weren't too many. Along the way today, you also see a bunch of these rail trees, called. They're just used for, they would hang rail all along the way, about every mile or so. They would have spare rail sitting out there so that if they did have a wreck or something along those lines, they didn't have to go down to New Haven to the Cedar Yards or something and bring extra rail up. They would have rail stationed out all along the way. This one happens to be in Vernon. Again, Vernon's done a very good job. They went out and got some rail and put it up there. This one's in Coventry. No rails on them, but if you see these things, that's what they are. They would have had rails sitting on them, spare rails sitting on them for when they needed them for repair work or just regular maintenance. We're now crossed over Steele's Crossing Road, coming toward Andover. This is Coventry and Watrous Road. I mentioned that, well, I didn't mention, sorry. The Watrous Road was another one of these roads that was closed off at one point in time. It was considered too dangerous. There were too many accidents. If you ever bicycle or pedal through the area, or you can kind of see it here, there's not a lot of visibility. If a train's coming down from Bolton, first of all, they're going downhill, so they're probably going at a pretty good clip. And you wouldn't necessarily be able to see it. If you look, this is the road, what's left of Watrous Road going down to Route 6 from the other side. And actually, you can see it here. This is an old picture. Ignore the fact that it says Bailey's, because it's really not Bailey's. There's no way that the topography here matches up to what's at Bailey's, but it does match up perfectly to what's at Watrous Road. So I'm almost 100% positive this is really Watrous. You can see it coming down. I only got this off eBay about a week ago. Otherwise, I'd have a picture going the other direction. But this is basically turned around, looking down here, so that this bank is this bank. But you can see how it drops off real quick on the other side here. So if you were coming up from Route 6 going across, you wouldn't have much time to see anything coming. If you were coming down, or either way, again, you just didn't have much. I understand there were a lot of fatalities there, and they finally shut the road down. But that's what's left today, so you can still find that. A little further in, you get into one of the larger cuts along the way. And again, I just find it fascinating as you still see the drill marks, just like they were almost drilled yesterday on these rock faces. Took a lot of work to drill those in, but once they drill them, again, just fill it full of black powder and run. They would then take all this fill, or all the rock debris, and create the fill that I talked about a little earlier. This was all done with dump carts and hand labor. This fill's right on the Coventry Andover line. It's down in here somewhere. But this whole thing, the picture doesn't do it justice for the true size and magnitude of that fill. But all done, again, with hand carts. A lot of labor. Just after you pass Bailey Road, get one of the few whistle stop signs, whistle posts that are still along the trail. Most of these, as you can see, this one was shot up pretty good. They were used for target practice along the way. There are a couple of them out there. But every crossing would have had one of those, and the engineer, when he sees that, he knows he's got to start blowing his whistle, because this one's coming up on Bailey Road, to start warning people, because we didn't have any, mechanical arms or even flashing lights at most of these intersections. It was purely the whistle that let you know. Also along the way here, up in the corner, if you take a look, there's an odd-shaped rock, and what that is one of the original markers for the town lines. So you can see a B on this one and an A. This is opposite sides of the same stone. So this one's facing Andover, so this is actually facing this direction, and this is for Bolton, which is facing off in the other direction. Many of them are not out there where they're supposed to be any longer. People have found better things to do with them, or they've been bulldozed, but those would have been along the entire periphery of the town at one point in time. But this one's there, and it's still visible from the trail. We saw a tunnel road in Vernon. We have, again, a similar structure. Dimension-wise, as far as the opening, the height, and everything else, it's almost identical to the one in Vernon. It's a little bit shorter in length, so we can't claim it's the largest like Vernon claims theirs is the largest. But we have far more extensive retaining wall, though, than Vernon has on theirs, so maybe that's our claim to fame. But again, as far as I know, that hasn't been touched. There's been no maintenance work done on that since the day it was built. Just there. Finally, we made it to Andover. Took a while, but we got there. This is what our station looked like in 1917. What's there today? Well, if you look in the weeds, you can find these concrete curbs. This is what they looked like a couple weeks ago at the parking lot. And this is the one that's kind of in the woods at this point in time. This is what it looks like once it's greened up, looking in this exact direction is what you would have seen for this station. This angular cut or whatever along the top here, I understand was put in one day when a train was coming down from Bolton, and it jumped the tracks up here at the intersection. This is Route 6 going across here, by the way. The end of Center Street. Well, first of all, Center Street was Route 6 at the time. Wasn't where it is today until 1933 as part of a WPA project. So this was the crossing for the main road. Train came down, jumped the tracks, and rode the curb all along the way. So instead of taking out the station, it dumped over here into the basically ravine and did no damage to the structure anyways. Obviously the train didn't wake out so well, but it left this nice marking along the side of it. And again, these are here today. So you can get a pretty good idea of where the station was. Unfortunately, I started investigating whether we could do something along the lines of what Vernon had done to mark the footprint of where the station was, but unfortunately the railroad sold that property in 1953, so the state does not own it. The state owns right up to this curb, but where the station actually sat is on private property at this point in time. This is just looking the other direction. Here's what the trail looks like today. Here's what you would have seen. The trail today for this part of it is probably right about this track. And you can see the houses that were built on the foundation of the hotel, and if the trees weren't there, you would have seen these two houses because they're still there. This particular house, the Baines, is what now own the property that the railroad sat on, and then the house that's pretty much being called an eyesore, the old elite residence, that's it right here. As you can see, at one time we had 4 different tracks. This was a full siding track. This is the track Peter was talking about. They went up at least as far as Shoddy Mill Road. And then you had 2 just dead-end tracks here that did not rejoin either the siding or the main that were just used for storage. Early on, when people were, early in the 20th century, 1900, people would get together and buy a carload of coal to keep their houses warm and to cook on and stuff. And they would just leave it sit on the siding up here, and people would go up with their bucket, take their share of coal out of the car, and they would use it, and it would just sit there on the siding. As I mentioned before, the original structure of the road went across and down in front of the church. So Center Street, again, was the main road until 1933.
So where the station is now, that's 14 Center Street? That's that little house?
It belongs to this house right here. Yes. Baines. Yvonne and Ken Baines. Yep, no, unfortunately I was up checking the deeds the other day and I found they bought, the property line is 15.8 feet from center. If you go along the tracks every once in a while, you might see about a 4x4 piece of stone sticking up out of the track where the current fill gets eroded or something. There's actually monuments every quarter mile implanted in the center of the main line through the entire thing. The surveyors, the railroad surveyors had put those in. And every once in a while, you'll see them sticking up through. Like if you look right where this track or this trail happens to start to disappear into the woods away from Route 6, a little bit west of this point, you'll see one of those sticking up through right now. And they would have a little hole in the top of them right where they would put their pendulum coming down from the surveyor's tripod. This is another view. This is coming up. You've been right in front of the church today. The road just goes up and over. There's a station, nice engine sitting at it, but that's pretty much what it looks like today. Here's a train leaving. You still see again the siding, the church in the background. So this is pretty much what you're looking at today. And right about in this area somewhere is where there is one of those surveyor stones sticking up. This is just past where the station was, heading into the woods, heading down toward my driveway or Route 316. That's what it looked like in the 1940s. These are pretty much self-explanatory, but here comes a train from the Willimantic direction. You see the station master. He's got a note on the hoop. Again, no radios in those days. This is how you communicated. If he wanted him to pull off at the siding, he handed him a note. If the guy missed the note, who knows? Probably it would be a frantic call up to the next station. This is a train coming in from the Bolton direction. This is a sack of mail. The station master is going to transfer that onto the train. You'll see a sack of mail come off of the mail car or a baggage car here in a minute. Right here, guy's going to drop off a bag of mail, and this guy's going to give him a bag of mail. When you had wrecks and other problems, you tried to fix them as close to where they happened as you could. Here's a new set of wheels being put under a freight car. This is happening right in front of the station. In a minute, you'll see the derrick picking it up, and you can see the church in the background. And here's Andover's through track. Here's the siding that they're working on. Comes a train from the Willimantic direction. See, we're getting a little bit later in time to see the size of these things compared to that 440 that I showed you early on. That's why they had to upgrade the rails and they had to upgrade all the bridges. Here comes a diesel coming through. This would be early 1950s, probably before 1952 because it still has the old New Haven paint scheme. By that point in time, the station was, for all intents and purposes, shut down. Maybe open 1 hour a day for express freight or something along those lines. All passenger service was stopped after the 55 floods took out a bunch of bridges down the Putnam area. Only freight continued after that point. Yep. As my father mentioned, because of the railroad, we did have a large hotel at one time sitting in town. This is just a little bit off the trail, but you can see today the foundation for the livery area, which was on the end of the hotel out here that's out of this picture. That's where the fire for the hotel in 1916 started. Some drunk guys were in there playing cards one night, kicked the lantern over and burned it and themselves up. This was before we had days of fire department. So everybody basically went up and you worked to try to keep other things from around it from burning, but there was no way you were going to touch putting that size building out with, a bucket brigade or anything. This is the back side of it. And again, if you look at the houses that are there today, you look at this brickwork, that's actually the brickwork that's right here. So they just started building again on top of what was there after they cleaned all the debris out. And again, this is the foundation for the end out here. Because of the railroad, we also were able to have a creamery in town. As you can see, the butter was shipped off to Boston and New York. There's no way that Andover would have been able to have a creamery. We wouldn't have had enough customers to buy the butter had we not had access to the railroad to ship it off to the major markets of Boston and New York. What's left today is basically the monument sign. There is a little historical marker back here to mark where it was, but it's basically the site of the monument today. We also had a paper mill in town. Everybody's familiar, I assume, with Case Mountain in Manchester, and maybe even the Case brothers as far as their paper mill. Well, Fred Case was a third brother that nobody really talks about. He came to Andover and built a paper mill here. This was the original water-powered mill that had a dam that you can still see the remnants of. If you look down past the post office, down in the woods in the fall, you can see the remnants of the dam down there. Backed Hop River up all the way up to Post Farm. There was a 24-horsepower water wheel on the end of this building. Ultimately, they switched over to steam power, as you can tell from the stack. And what's left today that's where our town garage is. But again, none of that would have been there if we didn't have the railroad. And again, what happened was, when you think of paper mill, don't think of stationery and newspapers and stuff. Think more of heavy, almost like corrugated cardboard, things that would have been used as insulation in transformers and things in those days. They would have been sitting in oil and soaked in things, and more like construction boards and stuff like that. Matter of fact, these are the product laying out drying in the yard here. So again, don't think little pieces of paper. And they were generally, what would happen was the railroad would bring in all the bins of discarded linens and things. This wasn't paper made out of tree pulp either. This was more cotton type papers and things. So they would bring it in by the bundle. Then the paper mill would convert it into the sheets of paper to order, album or button or leather or whatever kind they had for an order, and then ship it back out by the railroad. We also had a car dealership. Cars arrived by train. The guy got his friends together and brought them down there. This is along Merritt Valley Road. You can see Catherine's Tin Barn in the background. That replaced this barn after it burned. But that's where this is, where Russell's Tree Farm is right now. It's pretty much sitting where this house was. It burned in 1925. You had railroads, you had railroad wrecks. This is just west of Lakes Road. This house still exists, so you can get a pretty good idea where it was. That was Hoisington's for some of the older folks. I don't know whose house it is today. Again, you had a wreck. Everything was pretty much done by hand. 1910. There really didn't even, steam derricks were few and far between at that point in time. Pushed everything off the side. All the work was to get the line open again. It didn't really matter anything about cleaning it up. You cleaned it up later. The whole trick was to get the line open. Again, that's what it looks like today. Moving further down, we get to Hop River Station. That was the next place that had a double line of track going through. Today, this is what we look like at the spot. This is coming, if you're going this direction, you would just come over the bridge where it's at the Coventry-Columbia Town line. This train's coming up from Willimantic. And that station still exists. It's just up the road a little bit. It was moved. It's taken up the road here. It's on private property, just a little ways up Hop River Road. This is what it looks like from the other direction, how cleared out it was. This is Hop River Road going across. And this is what's there today. Big difference 75, 80 years makes. Moving on to the next part. This is where we're actually moving from, okay, the railroad's gone. It's done. It's finished. State's taken it over. The last act that the Penn Central did as they were selling it to the state was to pull up the rails. And they took somebody, I believe, stole all the wire for the telegraphs along the way a year or two earlier. But at this point in time, before the Penn Central signed the contract to actually sell the right-of-way to the state, they went through and pulled up all the rails. Because I believe at the time there was articles written that El Grasso, I believe, was the governor at the time, Her and her transportation group were trying to preserve it with the rails intact, with the idea of opening up it as a commuter line eventually. But the Penn Central had other ideas, and they had sold off the rails, so they got them pulled up before they signed the contract to actually sell it to the state. Still along the lines, my grandfather had me come out and take some pictures at the time he was doing the town report, so we went out and took a bunch of pictures at the time they were pulling it up. But the ties that were salvageable, obviously they picked them up and took them. The ones that they didn't think were going to make any good use for anything, they just left them in place. And remember when I used to ride my bike along there, it was for quite a bit of it. One of the first things that were done was they took out the wooden bridges at Flanders Road and Pucker Street. I don't have a real date on these. I can't find any photographs of the original bridges. As Herb mentioned early on, if anybody has anything or has anybody that they think might have some of these things, let me know. But anyways, there's just culverts there today, and finally this one used to be just a pond all the time going through it. They finally threw some gravel in there in the last couple of years. This one still gets quite wet. Along the lines, they took out the overpass in Andover in 1992. Again, a very narrow opening. Had some close calls with fire trucks going through there over the years. Many accidents there. You can see what it looks like with a train coming across it up here. And this is also, by the way, 1933 or so when they're making the new Route 6. Because again, before the WPA days, this was the main road. It was actually called Main Street. Now it's just Hebron Road. This is actually Monument Lane, this part of it. But they took down the entire western side of the supports for it, taking them all out. They did save a lot of the blocks and things, and that's what went into making the monument platforms for the monuments where they are now, which is right there. This is the old creamery building, by the way, after it was an apartment building. I also don't have any photographs of the Army National Guard, but the Army National Guard came through and did an awful lot of work on the trail. They started up in Vernon. Matter of fact, part of the trail up there is named for the particular group. I forget the name of it, but along the way. They also came down through Andover. They picked up a lot of abandoned cars. They picked up motorboats. They picked up all kinds of junk. A lot of the right-of-way had been used as a general dumping ground for many, many years. So one of the biggest things that the National Guard was able to do was clean up a lot of that stuff, haul that stuff away and get it out of there. They did address some drainage issues, even though they created a few drainage issues. Like at my driveway behind the museum, the whole thing was designed to flow counter-grade. So even though the grade of the track was going down, the water actually came back. They did that through piping. The National Guard dug up all the piping, left it, and then wondered why the water didn't go anywhere. And they graded and rolled the surface. So this was one of the first major efforts to really convert the old railroad bed into a usable trail. Another thing that was a problem were the old bridges. The one at Route 316 here in Hebron Road was missing the steel after they took out the abutment and took out the steel, but most of the bridges still had the steel. Some of them even still had the ties on them. Well, the Coast Guard cadets needed an engineering project, so Bill O'Neill got in touch with the Coast Guard, or vice versa. Somehow it worked out. The Coast Guard cadets came along, and they spent some time replatforming a lot of the bridges along the way. So this was the bridge that went across the Hop River at Columbia this side, Coventry this side. And here's the result of what they had. This is Columbia this side, Coventry that side. They're flipped, but I didn't have this picture until very recently, so I got to go back and get one the same direction. But the cadets also had some without any ties on them. These you kind of had to get off the trail, go around. This one's the one right along just off of Lake Road, where Lake Road goes today. You'd go down Merritt Valley Road a little ways and come back up on the trail. But again, they came along and they decked it and made it usable. What they did was they first designed things. They built a prototype actually on the Coast Guard Academy grounds, did some prototyping there, tested things out. When they found out when they got a design they were happy with, they came out and they constructed it. They did as much as they could at the Coast Guard Academy itself, making pieces, and then they just brought them out and put them in. 2000. They then did these two pictures are actually doing the bridge over the Blackledge River on the airline trail. This was the work that was done for our part of the trail, but these two actual pictures of construction, these came out of the, neat story. I had heard that this had happened. I was aware that this had happened, so I just sent off an email to the engineering department of the Coast Guard, wondering if I'd even get a return answer, never mind any information from them, asking if any reports or anything existed. And lo and behold, a day or two after I sent it off, I got a response back from the secretary down there, or the admin assistant, whatever they call them, saying, yes, matter of fact, I had just started like 2 weeks before they went out to do that project, and I took all kinds of pictures. And I'm thinking, oh, great, this is going to be cool. Unfortunately, I moved 2 years ago, and I threw them all out, was the very next line. So I went from high to low really quick. But luckily, the commander at the time that was in charge of this class that actually did this work had put together a presentation, and he still had a copy of the presentation. So it was a combination of 2 years, though. The year they did our work, 2000, and the year after where they did the airline trail was 2001. So that's a combination of both, but they used exactly the same type of engineering, the same type of structures to do both, so I figured it would work. There's another project when Route 6 was being, when Lake Road was being put through to Route 6 instead of stopping at Merritt Valley Road. Part of the project was to take out the Route 6 bridge. It for many, many years, again, became kind of a collection of trash underneath. This is actually the Boy Scouts picking up trash somewhere along the way. But that bridge got replaced by this culvert. And now we have our own little tunnel. About the same time that was happening, maybe even a little bit before it, obviously Andover had a huge hole in the trail. They had taken out the abutment from where I took this picture, left that one standing there, but again, you had to basically go down a rather steep, unforgiving embankment, over a guardrail, which I have many scars on my shins from going over, and then scurry back up probably my driveway on the other side to the museum to get back on the trail. Anyways, they started talking about let's bridge the gap. Along the way, a lot of money was put forth by the state. Originally $283,000, then another $90,000 added, and ultimately we ended up paying Echo Bridge $418,000 for this thing. Along the way, DOT contributed some work. Remember, DEP owns this, but DOT came out and they reworked this abutment to accept it, and they poured the concrete to put an abutment on the other side. So that was all over and above the $418,000 we paid to Echo Bridge. Took a long time, 2001 to 2011, but the bridge finally did start arriving, and they assembled it up on right across from the church, basically where the station used to be. This is where the station was. They assembled it that winter. Then the next spring, they literally drove it down the road. They got some house movers. They put some wheels underneath it. This is the power plant up here. It moved so slow it was almost imperceptible. But when you're moving houses, you can't go very fast. They took down the wires ahead of it. That's where it parked overnight. Then the next day, or actually I guess they were waiting for like 9 o'clock. They couldn't shut the road down until 9 o'clock. Then they drove it down and blocked off Route 316 for the night. And the next day they hauled it up and dropped it in place. Actually 5 years ago. It doesn't seem like it's been 5 years that bridge has been up there, but finally we filled it. So instead of gapping or bridging from what would have been about here to there, they had to go all the way over there because of the work the state had done earlier, taking out the support and realigning the road. Obviously, they're not done. Anybody that's been out on the trail knows there's still work to be done out there. Kings Road. This is what you see. And the reason for that is this support right here got damaged. For many, many years, there was all kinds of logs and debris and other floats they'd come down and made literally a dam across here. And a couple of storms, the force of the dam actually put this footing off, which caused the steel again to come down, made it an unsafe thing. So all efforts have basically stopped and had stopped in that direction. And the reason I'll use the words had is there's been a contract let very recently. Anybody that's been down there in the last week or last couple of months has seen surveyors tape all over the place. There isn't actually an engineering contract that was let to see what they can do about fixing this up. And this is the trail on the other side of it. This is going toward Willimantic, yes. Right. It ends right here at Kings Road. And then if you go down over this part and start coming up from Flanders Road, this is what you have for a trail. It's really not much of a trail. It's a lot like what the whole thing looked like before the Army Corps of Engineers and other people got involved. But basically from Kings Road to Flanders Road, for all intents and purposes, there's no trail. You can't get from here to there. You go down Kings Road, you go down Flanders Road, and you can get back on the trail behind that goes along Route 6, even though it's, again, not very well improved. It's certainly better than what you can see here in the corner. But it'll get there eventually. And I don't know what money has been allocated to this, but I know at least an engineering survey is underway. The end on the other side, they just spent like $6 million building a pathway along the river down there and connecting it to the airline trail, and they decked the bridge over the Willimantic River for the airline and so forth. The trick is they made no connection between our trail and that trail. You run into the bridge that still has the iron on it that goes across. Right back here is Willimantic waste paper. You got Mackey's right over here. But you have to get off the trail, go down through an area that was a homeless area with tents and not really a desirable area. And you came out, anybody as older as I am or older remembers maybe that there was a picnic area down there just next to the bridge on Route 6, a state picnic area. That's where you can come out. You can actually park in there if you get up on the trail. But you then have to get onto Route 6 and go across the bridge if you want to get onto all that next nice new $6 million paved trail there. But this bridge, again, it's perfectly all right. If they pulled it up and decked it like the Coast Guard did for the other ones, you could get across there. Hopefully Mackey's or somebody would let us build a little trail across there. And just, again, some of the things I already talked about. It would be real nice if Andover, Bolton, and Coventry could make some indications of where the stations were, just some information along the lines of what was there, place for picnic tables and things. And again, Vernon's done a real nice job with both historical signs. They also have the Adopt-A Trail along the way, so they have the sections all built up where they get various businesses and private individuals to pay, I think it's a $200 fee every year to sponsor a section of the trail that they then use for maintenance and upkeep along the way. Just some things that we may or may not consider doing for our part of the trail, and certainly what other people have done. And that's it, folks.